Well, thank you very much, Amanda, and I'd like to thank Amanda and Margaret, who's outside as well, who do a lot of work to make these lectures possible, so thank you very much for doing the organisation. There's quite a lot of people here who put their hands up to say that you haven't been to these lectures before. This is part of a series of lectures which I've given over a period of time, usually runs for a series of about 5 lectures. So I'm not going to talk about everything that happens in Parkinson's tonight, and in fact you can see from the title up there that I'm targeting a very specific area, and this is the second part of a bracket of lectures which talks about these problems which are not around movement. So to put this in context, the Parkinson's can be thought of as having these 3 stages of Parkinson's disease. The first approximately 3 to 6 years, and so don't go adding these up and say, oh, 6 plus 6 plus 3, 15 years, and that's the end. It doesn't work like that. It's just very approximately and just on average. That there are these 3 stages which the first few years are pretty easily managed by conventional medications, levodopa, etc., and the control is pretty good. The middle stage, which I'm going to call stage 2, is characterised by mainly motor problems. By motor, neurologists mean movement problems. And again, the medications work well in modifying the movements, but they become increasingly unreliable, and you have to take more doses a day, and they start to produce complications. And the last 3 years, or the later stage I should say, the late third stage, is characterised by a rise of symptoms that are not easily managed by medications, and in fact often the medications have to be reduced. And I spoke mostly about these last time, at the last lecture, so I'm not going to cover these topics at all on this lecture, and mainly what I'm going to focus on are these troubles that begin in the middle stage and cause us a great deal of problems, and partly they're produced by the medications, partly they're a consequence of the illness itself. So, as I mentioned before, these are the topics, and last time I spoke about these 3 as well, and if you're interested in these ones, they, as Amanda said, they're available on the Florey website through YouTube. So, first of all, I wanted to talk about impulse control behaviour, and the reason these 2 slides are up here is to understand how impulsive behaviour occurs and what it is. I'm going to talk a little bit about, first of all, how movements, the type of movements we're interested in, are produced. So this front part of the brain, this is the area that actually controls our fingers and makes them move, which is called the motor cortex. But this front part of the brain is called the frontal lobes. And their function is largely controlled by a series of nerve cells that come from the base of the brain and deliver dopamine. And part of those structures are what's affected by Parkinson's. So what they're doing in controlling movement is best understood by thinking about how we learn to drive a car, and that's why that's there with the L plate on it. So if you cast your mind back to when you were starting to learn to drive a car, and I've used this analogy before, so sorry to you who've heard it already say it, but it's relevant again. And that is that when you're starting to drive a car, all of your concentration is directed at figuring out how to get the gears and the clutch and those things to work together, and you really can't concentrate on where you're driving the car and what else you're doing. But as you become more proficient, in other words, as you learn how to make the movements or make them more automatic, then you can concentrate on where you're going and what you're doing, and eventually you get so automatic that you don't really think about actually that how you've actually driven the car, because it just happens without your attention. And that's the key process. So this part of the brain, one of its major functions is actually paying attention to what we're going to do. And we can really only pay attention to round about 2 or 3 tasks or 5 or 6 things, depending on how we measure it at once. And despite the popular view that men can't do it as well as women, probably evidence doesn't hold that up quite as well. But nevertheless, most of us can only pay attention to doing 2 or 3 tasks at once. So if we can only pay attention to a small number of things, we've got to do a lot of things automatically so our attentional gaze can actually work properly. So if you use the example of the car, we can really only pay attention to making the clutch and the gears work, or if we want to pay attention to where we're driving the car, we actually have to make movements or activities become automatic. And so and I'm going to talk first of all a little bit about how we make these chunks of activity or the automatic process, and then I'm going to talk about the balance of shifting our gaze. So this picture now is really very old. This gentleman who did this study, a man called Per Roland from Sweden, first published this back in 1980, so it's a very old idea, and he did what were blood flow studies by doing scans of human subjects, and he asked them just to make movements with their fingers like that. So don't really need to learn that, we can all do that without even thinking much about it. And what he found was that this area, which I said before was the motor cortex, became active. But then he asked subjects not just to make simple movements like this, but actually to learn a task. We had to do it in a particular order, which was, I can't remember, but let's say it was 2, 4, 3, 5, 3, 5, 3, 4, 2. Had to remember the order and do it that. And once that occurred, this extra bit of area called the supplementary motor area also became active. Then he did an extra step, which is said, just imagine, don't actually move, just imagine making those sequences of movements in your mind. And what he found was that just the supplementary motor area was active. And that led him to a set of theories which he suggested was that there was an image of the chunk of activity or the basis of activity that you were going to do that was being stored in this other part of the brain, whereas this motor cortex was just really the slave carrying out the simple task. So one of the ways of thinking about that is to look at a piece of music like this. This is Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, and if you look at this time key which he had written there, that means that each of these individual notes, let's take this one here, each note has to be played in 90 milliseconds. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means that 5 notes have to be played in the time that the ball would leave Mitchell Johnson's hand and pass your bat if you're the batsman. So that's pretty quick, 5 notes in that time. So most of us, well, none of us can play the note and wait to hear whether the sound was correct, because that would take us 5 or so of Mitchell Johnson's balls when he was delivering them. So it means that we have to play them automatically and not wait for the feedback or the sound to occur. And we think of these as what we call a complex movement when they're played as a package. And the individual tasks are the simple ones. So this is the thing, the batch of movement that comes as a phrase is what's carried in the supplementary motor area in the previous picture. So if we go back to here, what's held in there is that clutch of movements, whereas each individual note is held in this simple area. So we can think of learning to drive the car or changing the gear automatically, or a tennis serve when it's thrown up and there's a series of movements occur together, or a phrase of language that we might expect, are all chunks or complex movements or chunks of movement. So when we think about how we're going to occur when you're driving a car, if a cue or a stimulus occurs, such as the light goes green, then you execute a series of complex tasks, which is you change the gears and all the rest of it, and away you go. And they're what are called automatic chunks. While you're not thinking about how do I change the gear, you're saying the lights are go, I'm heading off the hill. But what, say, another cue or stimulus came along, such as your phone rang while you're driving the car. Now, that phone ringing elicits an automatic movement in many of us, which is to reach out and answer the phone. That happens automatically, so that's a chunk. So that means that this part of the brain not only has to have the automatic components, which require dopamine to carry out, but it has to have a means of inhibiting. And so you have to have a decision. Do you stop the car and answer the phone, or do you answer the phone, or do you not answer the phone and ignore it? Or, as many people do, they try and do both, which is probably not the best plan. So that process of inhibition is important unless we are going to be impulsive. That is, impulsively answer the phone while we're trying to go drive the car. And that process of balancing the cue to do it automatically, the urge to do it automatically, versus the inhibition, because not right now, it's not the best of times, occurs when our frontal cortex is working well. So we can think of it as a seesaw. On one hand, we've got the front part of the cortex, that's the walnut-looking stuff on the top. That's the cortex, and it provides an inhibition, don't do it now, versus the dopamine, which says, you've learnt it, do it. There's the stimulus, off you go. And so clearly when our brain is working at its best, then what we're doing is sometimes it's best to listen to this impulse, sometimes it's best not to. What's the circumstances? When do we not do it? When do we do it? Whereas when it's not so well, we either lean in this direction or are too inhibited. Now in Parkinson's disease, we have some of the things that lead to tipping it in this way, I should say, are drugs of addiction, because all drugs of addiction work by increasing the dopamine system. So they push us to become impulsive in the direction of which we learnt related to the learning of dopamine activity, dopamine-related activity. But Parkinson's does it as well through a number of processes. First of all, when you haven't got enough dopamine, you're tipped in that direction, so you have to think about how you're going to do every task. When some of the drugs are working too strongly, you're tipped in the other direction and movements become activities become more impulsive. So I've put this up here to talk a little bit how this might occur in terms of dopamine. So this is the normal, healthy, well, it's not healthy because it's a post-mortem, but if we could see inside it, it would actually have these dark areas around here called the substantia nigra, and it's called the substantia nigra because the chemical dopamine goes black, it oxidizes and marks this area. And this part of the brain lies right down here, and it sends nerve cells or nerve fibers up to innervate this frontal part of the brain. When Parkinson's is present, this black area is lost, indicating that there's less dopamine. And we can make comparisons about what happens if you lose your frontal lobes, or they don't work very well, is to compare it with a monkey who doesn't, from evolutionary reasons, doesn't have much frontal lobe. And monkeys are much more impulsive about what they do. They're curious, they can't block their activities, and you put stimulus or rewards up and they'll go and do it, even though it's not the wisest of activities to do. And so in Parkinson's, the frontal lobes become less efficient because the dopamine is less available. So that means, as I've said before, when the tasks are present and you aren't taking medications, then instead all those things like being able to automatically change the gears are harder to do. But on the other hand, when you restore dopamine, then particularly in the middle stages, it comes out as big peaks, and I'll talk through this slide in a minute, so that the dopamine is shifted to the other way. Now, this is a graph, and I'll talk you through how to read the graph, that if we were able to do what, this is some data that has come from my laboratory, but from a rat who was made Parkinsonian. And so we were able to put a probe inside the brain, but the finding would be very similar in humans, which we can deduce for lots of other reasons. And so that this is the time when the drug was given, and this is the amount of dopamine that's actually spilling over in the brain. And the rat that didn't have Parkinson's, you can see that the dopamine is the blue line. The dopamine hardly shifted, even though we'd given a drug for treating the Parkinson's. In the rat that had Parkinson's, the dopamine level was low at the beginning, in keeping with it having Parkinson's, but then it became really very, very high and then faded away over about 2 to 3 hours. And that's the same thing that happens in people who have the involuntary movements in dyskinesia, is that it's low, it goes up very high to produce the involuntary movements, and then fades away again over time and wears off over 2 hours to 4 hours. And this is because the nerve terminals, which would normally store the dopamine that's been made, can't store it. And that's what would happen, for example, in the animal that didn't have the Parkinsonism. We gave it levodopa, it just stored it and kept it in there without hardly increasing at all. Now, the reason this is, I put this picture up, is that this is another rat which we did the same study, and in this animal we gave the animal cocaine. Now, cocaine is a drug of addiction which blocks dopamine being taken up inside the nerve cell. So in other words, it's exactly the same as not being able to clear the dopamine away when you give levodopa. And you can see that the curve looks very similar to what happens with someone who's given levodopa and has Parkinson's. Now, that means that when you, anecdotally, many will know, but I can tell you also that from studying people who have take cocaine, is that things are fine on this stage, and in fact there's a degree of buoyancy about people's behaviour, and that's commonly what's called the high. But once it starts to recede, people become anxious, sweaty, agitated, and the same thing happens with people when the levodopa ebbs away when they take their dose. And so people will often tell you that they're off here at this stage, even though we can see that they're still moving, and that's because they feel like they're no good. They feel like they can't think properly and plan properly, even though clearly the medications are still working in terms of the motor function. So which are the drugs that are worst at producing impulsive behaviour? They all do it. The peaks of action of levodopa can do it, but these ones called the dopamine agonists, or the D2 agonists, which talks about a particular type of dopamine receptor, and their brand names are Fitzroy, Nupro to a lesser extent, and Cabasar, which is not really used much now, but still available, and that's their pharmaceutical name, are the worst offenders at producing the impulsive behaviour which I talked about. So what does it look like? Well, the famous ones, the ones that everyone will read about in the newspapers, are gambling, internet obsession, particularly on internet sex, hypersexuality, shopping and eating. And according to gender stereotyping, these are more common in men and these are more common in women. And it occurs in about 15% of people who take these medications. So it doesn't happen to everybody, and we're not clear why it should happen to some people and not others. And it takes time to build up, so just because you take your first dose doesn't mean you'll be down the pokies on the spot and fritting the family fortune away. But be serious. People actually do spend many hundreds of thousands of dollars inadvertently because of these drugs. So they are, it's not just that it's a little bit of gambling, it can become a big problem. It's typically worse on the higher dose. So, for example, with Fitzroy, a starting dose would be 0.75 milligrams. It's unusual to ever see impulsive behaviour developed on that level. But on 3 milligrams, it's not uncommon, and so 1.5 is reasonably safe, but 3 we worry a little bit about. But remember, not everybody, 15%. And I think the real way of managing this is to be, well, first of all, if you're the neurologist, is to make sure you warn people. And because it's such an unusual side effect that you wouldn't necessarily think that this is related to the medication. And so on your side, as patients, then it's very important to be informed and understand this, but also to inform the people around you, because, as I mentioned, it doesn't happen straight away. It's often 6 months after you've been on the drug, and you might have forgotten that warning that people gave you at the beginning. And so you need people around you looking to see, are you becoming a bit more driven, a bit more focused on habits and hobbies, etc., because most of the problems don't begin like this. They actually begin by being a bit more fixed about your hobbies, not being able to let things go and being a bit pressed about ideas, making it want to be your way and exactly how it should, fit in exactly how you've planned. So if people are around you and can tap you on the shoulder and say, look, things are changing, then you can have a conversation and reduce the drugs. Now, if you reduce them early, usually it clears up pretty well, providing it's mainly drug-related and not due to changes in the brain function and the brain architecture, which can occur under some settings. Whereas if it's allowed to continue for a couple of years, it becomes very, very hard to undo it. So even if you lower the drugs. So the most important way of avoiding this is to be informed and pay attention as to whether the changes are occurring. So sometimes, though, it's not possible, because I mentioned before that the D2 agonists, the ones we talked about, are the common culprits, but they're not the only culprits. In fact, changes to the front of the brain, we talked about it mainly being a dopamine problem, and that seesaw, I talked about it, could be because there's too much dopamine drive, but it can occur because there's not enough inhibition. And this particularly occurs in people later in the disease where they lose partly their motivation to do something about it, and that's a smaller component of impulsive behaviour. The best way of doing it is to reduce anxiety and the stimuli around you. So I'll put all of these up there. So by that I mean that when people are more anxious and they've got pressure on around them, they have less time to consider what it is that they're doing. And this is true of any one of us. When things are pushed, we don't realise how we're making mannerisms, how we're doing things, how our behaviour's changing, and we focus very much on the goals at hand rather than thinking, oh, how is this affecting other people? How am I behaving here? I've talked about observing the medication, and the other thing is to avoid trigger factors. So, for example, a lot of people who get into trouble with the internet tend to sit on the computer later in the evening. They get on 9 o'clock and then suddenly it's 10, 11, 12 and keep on going later and later in the evening. And that then sets up a pattern of behaviour which is difficult to undo. So if you can keep your sleep pattern normal and use the internet or the circumstances which set up your behaviour, so just to keep it away from the big four, I know one person whose compulsive behaviour was compulsive cleaning. Now you might think, what's wrong with that? And originally his spouse thought that was a very fine thing, until it meant that everyone was being cleaned around and pushed around and all the time, and then it began to put stresses on everybody. So again, if that can be avoid the factors which triggered his cleaning, which was don't go through this by leaping up immediately, the dinner's finished, to go and rush off and do the dishes, but have a plan that says, well, you don't need to do it now, and step away from it. So there are important ways of avoiding the triggers. So if gambling is your problem, make sure that people can help you not get down to the pokies, or change the amount of money that's available so the spending doesn't get going. Most important thing is don't make it a conflict in the family. So if it can be managed early and you share it as everyone's responsibility to be conscious of that it's going to occur, you actually reduce the chance of it actually blowing up, and that means everyone's more open. So I'm going to stop impulse and now moving to a new topic. But it's not unrelated, and that's around depression and anxiety. And these are two related things, but they're not the same thing. So I'm going to talk about depression first, and then I'm going to come back to anxiety. Now, the most common reason we think that people get depression is that it's got something to do with the loss of the dopamine system in the brain. We know that dopamine has something to do with mood. It's not the whole story around keeping mood up. In fact, serotonin may be more important, and it mightn't be just those two chemicals alone. But we do know that disturbances of dopamine and drugs that improve dopamine actually can avoid depression. We also know that people who've never been depressed really had a depressive personality throughout their younger years, in the 3, 4 or 5 years before developing Parkinson's, can develop depression. So we think it is something about the prodrome that makes people at risk of this depression occurring. And often there's I'll go back a bit. There's different types of depression. We sort of talk about it as if it's one big condition and all depression's the same. But some depressions are more commonly linked to anxiety, and Parkinson's does have that component to it, that anxiety is a bigger factor. I've really said that already. The other thing is we think that it's affected by sleep problems, and sleep problems, and I'm going to talk about this later on, is very common in Parkinson's disease. And so people who have changes in sleep pattern, which can accompany the depression, but we also know that bad sleep worsens depression and increases anxiety. And just anecdotally, most of us know that if we haven't slept well, you don't feel so good, and it's harder to actually see the bright side of life. And I talked before about it being linked to anxiety and these changes in chemicals, and we know that people who have more of these swings are both anxious, as I've talked about before, and are also more likely to be depressed. And if we can smooth them out, we can reduce, but we can't cure the depression. So the anxiety component is important, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And we also know that when people are anxious, then your ability to plan and balance impulsivity and other activities is worsened. And I've told this story before, to some people here, but I'll say it again, that this happens to us all. I tell the story of me travelling to Charles de Gaulle airport from here, which means an overnight trip, and so you arrive there short of sleep. I don't speak any French. I had a connecting flight. My plane was late. It was departing from another part of the airport, and I arrived there short of sleep, anxious that I was going to miss my flight, got flustered, made some silly decisions that ensured that I missed my flight. I ended up going down the wrong corridor. And looking back afterwards, if I'd only just stopped, had a bit of a think about it, it would have connected. And this is a good example of a combination of anxiety and fatigue interfering with my executive function or my planning. So it happens to everybody, but if you've already got a bit of trouble with your executive function because of the Parkinson's affecting that dopamine balance, then anxiety is going to make your thinking and your planning a lot worse than it would have otherwise been. So what is depression? Well, the public view of depression is often this picture of that comes from the movies of someone who's usually younger, very teary and upset about some fracture in their events of life. But actually, particularly in older people, that is people like me, and men, we actually see not so much sadness, although that's a key component, but actually lack of interest, withdrawal, flat mood, and lack of engagement. So we have to be careful that we don't think about it with the stereotypes of, tearfulness and the obvious manifestations of sadness. It's much more common for it to be those people wouldn't be interested in me. I don't want to get engaged. Why would I want to do that? They'll just get bored with what I've got to say, and lack of motivation, don't want to get up and do things. And early on, just talking about it is enough to actually get people engaged and back in and clear the depression. And this is why it shouldn't be ignored, because if you don't, then you have to get to the next step, which is start using medications, which commonly happens. It's not necessarily that there's a problem of personality weakness, but stepping in early and taking changes in what we call mental health, which is taking steps to engage yourself back with people, taking steps to improve motivation and having a schedule and a plan and not turning down invitations to do things, can actually make steps of changing these behavioural attitudes. It's also hard to treat anxiety, which we've talked about before, if depression is present. You always have to treat the depression first. So often people present with the anxiety component being more obvious, even though underneath it all is this lack of interest and engagement. And so unless the doctor and everyone else is talking and asking questions, you end up treating the anxiety, getting nowhere because you haven't really addressed the depression. Similarly, anxiety shouldn't be ignored. So I've talked about many of the factors, and some of these are hard to manage, like the rise and fall of the drugs. But and anxiety in Parkinson's particularly often needs medications, whereas if we were talking to someone who didn't have Parkinson's, we would say, look, perhaps try cognitive behaviour therapy, perhaps putting more emphasis on mindfulness. These are still important in Parkinson's, but often we have to do it in conjunction with using anti-anxiety medications. And some of the ones that we use are not the traditional ones like Valium, but tend to use actually drugs that are linked to antidepressants. So drugs like mirtazapine would be a much more common one to use, where we can treat both the depression and the anxiety together, and sometimes use drugs like quetiapine, which are more commonly seen in perhaps treatment of schizophrenia, but they have a very special place in Parkinson's because they're good for anxiety. So sometimes anxiety is linked to changes in cognition if it starts later in the disease. I talked a lot more about that in the last lecture, but it's one of the things we always look for as doctors, is to start saying, oh, if anxiety started now 8 years into the disease, is there something else going on in terms of your ability to think and work problems out and remember things? Nevertheless, anxiety is made worse if you're like me in Charles de Gaulle, things have been sprung on you and you're tired and you're weary. So if you can reduce complexity, that is, don't make the task too complicated. And a common one, for example, is Christmas Day. The whole family's around, everybody's there, there's a lot going on, everyone's a bit stressed and hassled, and we've invited a person around with Parkinson's because we want them to join in and see everybody, but there's too much going on and that makes the anxiety worse. And so just be thoughtful around those questions as to whether the big family do's and so on, and that's the type of thing that I'm talking about. Next is sleep. I'm going to talk about that as the next step. So Amanda mentioned the kinetograph. One of the things we can do, which is this device that sits on the wrist, is that we can measure some aspects of people sleeping. And this person wore this. This is a person without Parkinson's and without sleep trouble. And this is midnight to midnight, and they wore it for 6 days, and every time there's a black spot there, they were very, very still enough to be asleep. So we can see that from midnight till 8:30, they were pretty well still as can be, sleeping. And did the same every night, and they were still for long pitches of over an hour to an hour and a half, perhaps got up to go to the loo there because it's 30 minutes. And then during the day, there's ups and downs, perhaps a little bit of a nap for half an hour there. And then 6 o'clock, I presume the television came on and the news bored them because they were nodding off. And then at 11, quarter to 12, off to bed. But the point being is that sleep here is in big chunks, still for about an hour to an hour and a half at a time. Now, the sleep disorders that happen in Parkinson's disease, there are quite a lot of them, but they interrupt this still pattern. So the most common one is this thing we call Rem Sleep Disorder. And Rem stands for rapid eye movement. So during our dreaming phase of movement, our eyes move about rapidly, and if you watch someone who's asleep during the dreams, you can see the eyes flicking around, and those of you who have a dog, you can see the same thing too. And if you have a child, 3 or 4 year old, if you watch them, the same things will be happening when they're sleeping and dreaming. Now, our nervous system shuts off the thinking part of our brain from the moving part of our brain when we go to sleep. And that is so that when we have our dreams, we don't start moving around and acting out the thoughts that we have. And in children particularly, or anyone who sleepwalks, what happens is that thinking part and the moving part are reconnected inappropriately. Now, one of the things that allows us to wake up in the morning and make that reconnection is that under normal circumstances, dopamine levels go low overnight and then increase again just as you're about ready to wake up again, and they all fluctuate over the night as the stages of sleep occurs. Now, we don't know why, but we think that something happens to the dopamine levels that occur in the early stages of Parkinson's before it's diagnosed, and about 20 to 30% of people have this Rem sleep disorder even before diagnosis, particularly in men. And what that happens is that people will, in the middle of their dreams, start fighting whoever it was that was in their dreams, or batting them off, and the bedclothes go everywhere and the spouse gets kicked in the shins or whacked. But there, people in the morning are completely unaware of it. And that's the earliest sleep disorder that we see. And restless legs is another one in which there's a regular kick, comes out, and little bursts like that, and again the spouse collects it in the shins, and it breaks up sleep much more. So this is someone with restless legs sleep pattern, and you can see that it looks very different from this. And one of the things that makes it different too is that there's quite long black sections here from 10 till midnight, but round about 1 o'clock they start to disappear, and this is very characteristic of a restless leg sleep pattern, and you don't tend to see that in REM. And in the REM sleep pattern, the other thing is you start to see this, which is daytime sleepiness. So this disrupts the sleep, stops even though the person doesn't actually wake up, but it causes lots of micro-arousals and butts into their proper dream patterns. And so they're drowsy and sleepy in the daytime, whereas with the REM sleep, it's not so much of a problem. It's really a problem interrupting the spouse's sleep, but not the others. Obstructive sleep apnea, which is the blocking off of the airways and the association with snoring, is much more common in Parkinson's, and it is a problem because it also produces these sorts of frequent arousals and daytime sleepiness. And then there's another problem in Parkinson's, is there's just a fundamental disruption of the sleep architecture. So as adults, we have this pattern where we sleep for long periods and then are awake, whereas we tend to get this pattern where people sleep for a bit, wake, sleep, and the same thing is held throughout the whole daytime. And so it tends to go back to being much more of an infantile sleep pattern in severe cases. And unfortunately, there's not much we can do about this broken sleep architecture, other than to recommend, and what's probably happened here, is that you actually go to bed in the daytime and sleep more and sleep properly. People can also have what are called secondary sleep problems, and you don't need to have Parkinson's for this, and that is that if you have pain or depression, or bladder problems, which may or may not be associated with the Parkinson's. And what you tend to see then is get off to sleep okay and sleep pretty well until whatever it is, the pain or the bladder problems, and sometimes depression is associated with early morning wakening. and then people just don't sleep very well and they wake up unrefreshed and then often go back and have a sleep later in the morning. And so this would be a typical pattern of someone who had depression. And the last problem is one I alluded to before, which is poor sleep hygiene. And this is the sort of thing that people who play with the internet too much do. And that is that they take their iPhone or whatever it is to bed and go to bed too late, then get up too late and are sleepy in the daytime. And again, blue lights from electrical gear is bad news for sleep and so shouldn't be done. So why does it matter that people have sleep problems? Well, apart from the fact that it's no fun being in the middle of the night staring at the ceiling, it's daytime sleepiness is a bad thing. It affects cognition and it may alter mood in the way we talked about, and if in fact you have significant daytime sleepiness, you'll lose your license. And so it has a significant effect on people's ability to enjoy social interactions with others. So what can be done? Well, first of all, recognise that there's a problem. Now, this is a difficult thing because when you ask a couple affected by Parkinson's disease and ask the person who has Parkinson's, are you sleepy in the daytime? They'll mainly tell you, oh, perhaps a bit. And you ask the spouse and they'll say, oh, well, yes, a lot. And so most people with Parkinson's who have a sleep problem would say, oh, look, I probably sleep for about half an hour. Going back to this case, that person denied he had a sleep problem, but his spouse said that was the size of his sleep problem. And so, coming back to this, how can we manage it if the problem is denied? So one of the reasons that measuring it becomes important, because we can then have a discussion that says, well, you mightn't think you do, but this is what you're really doing, so what are we going to do about it? So you may need to make a test to actually get the diagnosis, such as wearing the device or even going for a proper sleep lab, and we can actually treat it. So Rem sleep, we can stop late evening levodopa, which often exacerbates it, or we can put people on clonazepam, which is will often settle it. Treat restless legs by putting dopamine well into the night using Upro patches or things like that. Obstructive sleep apnea, well, a sleep pump is well proven effective therapy there. And treating bladder problems, well, it mightn't be Parkinson's, it might be prostate or bladder floor irritability, which often happens in women in postmenopause. And pain could be Parkinson's, but just common old or garden osteoarthritis can significantly do it, and there's quite good treatments for that, including just Panadol Osteo if it's taken properly and in sufficient doses. So it is something that can be fixed if it's recognised. I'm just conscious of the time, so I'm going to go quickly here and talk about autonomic problems. And what we mean by the autonomic nervous system is the part of the system that controls blood pressure, bowel, and which I talked about last time, bowel function, bladder function, body temperature and sweating. So I'm not going to talk all about these, but I'm going to talk about constipation. Now, this happens very early in Parkinson's in a significant number of people. So if you take a history, you'll find that something like about 70% of people with Parkinson's have had constipation for 5 to 10 years before the diagnosis. And this is a nerve cell in the brain, that part that I showed you with the black bits, the substantia nigra, and they have these little pink things in them called Lewy bodies, and since 1912 we've known that this is the pathological hallmark of Parkinson's, and we now know that these occur in the nerve cells of the gut and the mouth and also in the skin. So there's a gentleman called Brach who's a neuropathologist from Vienna, and he'd done a large number of post-mortem studies on people who did or didn't have Parkinson's and looking for Lewy bodies. And what he found was that the first place that you can find them in the brain is here in this structure called the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve goes from that part of the brainstem all the way down here to innervate the gut. And the other part was in the olfactory part, which goes in through the nose. And he then found that that's the first place that you find it. And then you find it in this area here, which is the locus coeruleus, which controls sleep, which may explain why sleep happens next after constipation. Then you find it in the substantia nigra, and last of all you find it up here in the cortex in later stage Parkinson's. And this led him, can't remember whether I've got it coming next there, this led him to a theory which I think is now gaining more and more credence, that it's possible that Parkinson's actually begins by something occurring in the gut or the olfactory system and spreads via the olfactory nerve into this part of the brain or via the vagus nerve into this part of the brain. And so I'm not wanting to tell you that it all begins in the gut, but that's a serious consideration that people are thinking about. In fact, is this disorder really one that began in some way or other by something, be it a toxin, be it something to do with infectious agents, somehow or other spreading throughout the neuroaxis in that way. Anyway, back to more mundane things, constipation. So that's why we think constipation begins very early on, because the nerve cells in the gut were subsequently found to be present whenever you see it in the dorsal nucleus of the vagus, as Braque had found. You find that the nerve cells in the gut have Lewy bodies, and that therefore it's going to be present right at the beginning of the disease. So treating it is important, and I'm going to talk about why, but you can delay the problems with constipation by bulk in the diet. Importantly, increasing fluid intake to 2 litres. I can't stress how important that is. And exercise at least 2.5 hours per week. If it's there, treat it by bulk forming drugs, not irritants, things that go to the chemist and ask for things that will increase the bulk of the material in the large colon. If severe, you can use osmotic agents like Movicol. Don't use irritants because the bowel just gets used to those. And wait for the bowel to respond and then keep ahead of it. So if you haven't got constipation and you're needing things to keep it that way, keep it that way. Don't stop them until you get constipation again, because usually what you produce is a problem of how you ate and treated it 3 days earlier. So always keep ahead of it. Now, why does it matter? Well, if you don't, it continues, it almost always is progressive. And if you don't try and delay it and treat it, you get into these severe problems more quickly, and they cause bladder problems. And so a lot of the times when we see incontinence or trouble with urge, it's because there's also underlying constipation. It eventually, or many cases, it can lead to requirement of disimpaction, which is no fun for either the patient or the doctor. And it can also cause a lot of abdominal discomfort. So I do urge you as something to take seriously. And lastly, I'm going to talk about bladder function. And the first question is, it's divided into 2 problems. One is people who have to get up a lot at night. The first question there is, what's normal? So you don't get past 60 of either gender if you don't have to get up once or twice a night. So we don't take that as really too much trouble. What we're talking about is more frequently than that. The other thing is, not all problems in the bladder are Parkinson's disease. People with Parkinson's can get problems with their prostate as well, and they can have had babies and have bladder floor instability and bladder floor weakness. So these are often treatable, so they should be considered as well. And you can often, people get trouble with bladders, also with Parkinson's, because it's, again, dopamine is involved in keeping the bladder floor stable, so that it doesn't keep contracting and leading to the bladder to empty. And so when you lose dopamine overnight, because we don't tell you not to take medications, then the bladder floor loses that and starts to become irritable in the night, and then leading to the need to empty the bladder. So sometimes using long-active drugs like Nupro or Cifrol can help to increase the bladder floor stability. Sorry about the spelling mistake, is that the other question is, we often look at this problem about, was the person woken so they go to the toilet, or is it the other way around, that they went to the toilet and then they were awake? So sometimes it's sleep pathology is the problem, because you wake up and actually if we kept you asleep, you wouldn't have gone to the toilet, wouldn't have noticed the problem. So again, it's important to make the diagnosis. Was it the bladder that woke you, or is it the sleep problem that got you up and then you went to the toilet just to pass the time? So bladder function. So that's the problem during the daytime now, is urgency and incontinence. Well, bladder floor instability, I've talked about before. It can be something to do with too many birthdays, but it can also be a problem that dopamine levels are getting low. We can treat them, bladder floor instability, by getting people to empty the bladder properly and go frequently rather than waiting till you have to run quickly. That's bad enough socially, but if you've got impaired mobility, you're more likely to have falls trying to get to the toilet in a hurry. You're also more likely to have accidents. So again, emptying bladder floor is important. Drugs like Aricept, which we sometimes give to people for anxiety and cognition, so more commonly used in Alzheimer's, but they will make the bladder floor work less well. And so that sometimes can cause people, even though, to suddenly become incontinent. I've mentioned that not everything's due to Parkinson's. I've mentioned that constipation can make the bladder not work well. And of course, don't forget that everyone can get infections. I'm just going to jump through this and go to the end. So this is an unashamed bit of advertising. We run the Australian Parkinson's Registry at St Vincent's, and we're always looking for people to come and volunteer, whether you've got Parkinson's or not. We'd like your blood. So, and we would also need to examine you in a very formal and stereotyped way. And if you're interested, if you just email this with your name and address, it requires you to turn up at St Vincent's, have the blood taken, and it takes about an hour and a half to go through all of the process. And the other person is, you can contact Amanda and she can set up a time as well. But I'm sorry it took us long, but anyway, I've got time for some questions.